second session. So we have Christian and Ognjen from Zulke, and yeah, yes, when we have cheerleading, yes, that's the spirit. Good, 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 excellent. So okay. So I'll let you guys like do your stuff, but with all of these cheerleaders here, so you have this amazing bot that you can rate, and then these guys can go and be on the stage there, upper. So please help them be there. And yeah, like ask questions during the talk when you just have something in your mind. Shoot question to the bot. I will read it out loud so everybody will hear it. And yeah, please. Do your thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Test.
Test, mic check.
Works, huh?
Yeah.
Dobro jutro, Beograde. I'm Chris.
And Guten Morgen, Belgrade. I'm Ognjen.
And we don't see the slides.
So that's basically it.
We do have slides, though. Thank you. We both work at Zulke. Ognjen here in Belgrade, and I work at the Zulke office in Zurich, in Switzerland. We both work at the same project, and over the last half a year or so, we migrated the Angular 1 application to an Angular 4 application. Today we want to talk about how we did it and what lessons we learned on the way to our Angular 4 application. Before we go into the details, I would like to start with a story. So the story takes us back all the way to 2014. So that's 3 years ago. Or in JavaScript ages, it's like a century. It's a very long time ago. And back then, in 2014, Angular 1.3 was like the latest technology to implement single-page applications. The main character of the story is this guy here. He has a big backpack full of Angular 1 knowledge, and he travels to Paris.
Poor guy.
He travels to Paris because he wants to learn new stuff, new Angular 1 stuff, at the conference, at an Angular conference called NG Europe 2014, which was here. I know it's a long shot, but was somewhere there at 2014? Okay, was a long shot. So he learned a lot of things about Angular 1 at this conference, but he also learned about Angular 2. Angular 2 was introduced at NG Europe 2014, and back then it sounded like a great framework. It was built on the latest web technology, ECMAScript 6 and all the web component stuff. It was fast, easy to develop, so it was a perfect framework. But there was one problem. It just deprecated everything all the developers known from Angular 1. And they had no idea or no migration path or whatever how to get from an Angular 1 application to an Angular 4 application. So our developer was quite disappointed with this announcement, and he did what everyone does when he's disappointed with something. He starts tweeting. So did a lot of other Angular developers as well. So the whole community was really, really pissed about the announcement back then. And these are actual tweets from 2014. And as you can see, like, there was a big shitstorm coming down onto the Angular team. That was 2014. So to sum it up, 2014, nobody thought it's going to be possible to migrate the Angular 1 application to an Angular 4 application. Now let's jump into our time machine, come back to 2017.
Yeah, thanks. So first, let's check the state that we have in 2017. Could you please raise your hand if you're using Angular in your daily-to-daily work? What about AngularJS? Anybody? And is anybody running a hybrid application actually in production? Cool. Yeah. So that's exactly the state that we now have. So we have a running hybrid application, Angular 1.6, Angular 4, that's running in production at the moment. And the point of this talk is to try to explain you the questions, to answer the questions why we did the migration, what should you consider if you decide to go with the migration, then how did we do it, so what are the approaches to actually do the migration, different ones, and what did we choose and why, and also to try to just see some of the things that we bumped into, some issues that we had, and how did we get over them. So let's just dive right in. And the first question that pops up is why migrate? So basically, when you think about it, AngularJS, it's quite a stable framework. It's a good framework. It solves a bunch of issues that you might encounter in web development. And it's actually fast enough for most of the use cases that you have. So, so when you think about it, is there really a need to migrate to a new framework just because it's new? You need to think about the effort that you're going to put into the migration, and then to see that the benefits that you might get from it should be more than that effort, of course. What's more important about AngularJS is that it has this vast community, and basically among your colleagues, among the people on the net and in the open source communities, you can find a lot of solutions to everyday problems. So it's quite fast to develop and do new stuff with Angular. And one of the reasons that you should consider when you think, oh, should I do the migration or not, and that we thought about, is what's the, let's say, duration of development in your project. So if you have a project that's going to last for, let's say, 6 months or maybe a year, active development, do you really want to do the migration, or you can just stick to AngularJS that solves your issues? And in our case, in our project, it's actually a project that's going to be developed for at least 4 or 5 years from now. So we thought that now with 2 streams of AngularJS, which is slowly fading out, in our opinion, and the new Angular, Angular 2, Angular 4, or just the new Angular, which is now rapidly growing with the community, we thought that it's a good time to jump on that wagon and try to just migrate while the code base is still relatively small. So yeah, that was the reasoning. And then why Angular 4? What from the, let's say, features side of the framework? Basically, in our opinion, it is a better framework than AngularJS. As the developer team of Angular says, it's basically Angular is built on the good parts of AngularJS. So you have less boilerplate code. It is a faster framework. You have first-class TypeScript support, for example. Then you have the change detection and dependency injection, 2 mechanisms that were, let's say, flaws on AngularJS, which are completely reinvented and really provide much more flexibility when you work with Angular apps. And then there is the Angular client, of course, not to forget it, that basically helps you to completely don't think about the configuration unless you have some specific cases in your application. So you can just run it and the application is there. And it also provides generators so that can speed up development and so on. And maybe the next obvious question that comes into mind, okay, why didn't you mitigate your AngularJS issues with other frameworks like React, Vue? They are stable, they are solving those issues, they are fast. And there are 2 answers to that question. And you should also probably consider them if you're considering migration. First one is that the team, our team, and probably a lot of people that work with Angular are actually quite well versed with AngularJS because it's there so long. So with the similarity of syntax between the two frameworks, you're going to see later on in the presentation, it's actually not that big of an effort for a developer to switch to the context of Angular instead of AngularJS. And the second thing, the more important thing, is the Angular team actually went to great lengths to enable you to do the migration sequentially. So you don't need to go to the basement and then refactor your application to a completely different framework, typing like mad for a month or so, just to get back with this new application. You can actually do it sequentially, step by step, and then that makes it, you avoid the big bang. And that also makes it to, let's say, you can easily sell that to your clients or the stakeholders in the project and so on. So yes, hopefully that at least to some extent answers the why question, and Chris will now tell you a little bit more about how.
Test that. Okay, now let's see how we migrated our application. whenever you start a migration or a refactoring, you're going to take some risks. Because usually, that's my experience, it's going to take longer than you expected, which puts you into a lot of pressure, maybe because there's a release coming and you have to finish the refactoring. So for us, one of the most important points was when we started the migration, that we don't put ourselves in a situation where we have to actually finish the migration till the end of the sprint, end of the release cycle or whatever. This meant for us we wanted to get into a state where we can go into production without having to migrate the whole application. And that's called hybrid application. So we want to get rid of the AngularJS code eventually and just have an Angular 4 application, but we want to deploy to production as soon as possible again. So we have 3 steps, or we split it in 3 steps. The first is preparation, the second is go hybrid, and the third one is then continuously migrate. So as you can see, the second one, the go hybrid, is actually the step where we have to finish before we can deploy to production again. So you want to have this step as short as possible. So it's kind of like cooking. Whenever you want to cook something and you want to be finished soon with the cooking, when you have your guests, it's very good to prepare very well before, so it's easier to actually cook then. And it's the same with the migration. So when you prepare, there's an excellent guide from the Angular team itself. They really cover the whole topics about how you prepare your Angular 1 application and how you actually can then do the migration itself. So we're not going to go into this topic with our talk because you have a very good source here. But we want to highlight just the most important points. And for us, the most important point about the preparation is the component-based architecture. There are other topics like going to TypeScript or using Webpack or whatever, but it's not necessary. But I think the component-based architecture is necessary to actually do a migration. It's really difficult without a component-based architecture. We go through a sample application today, and I just want to introduce you to the sample application very quickly. This is already a component-based architecture. So we have the application root on top, and 2 pages, the driver pages and the car pages, which both list just a list of drivers and a list of cars. And we can then dive into a detailed page for a driver or a car. Let me show you how that looks like in code.
Show the frog.
Ah, we have a frog. Yeah, sorry. Coding slide. So I don't go too much into detail here, but the important takeaway here is that's the hybrid app, huh?
Yep.
The structure of the application. So we have the app root component, the one we just saw here. And we already used the component from Angular 1.5. And the same goes with the driver. It's also just a component, again here, and so on. The driver itself is also a component. So that's our application structure we start with. Okay.
Yeah. And once you do the preparation, so once you have your AngularJS application as a component-based application, which is the main, let's say, requirement for having running into a hybrid, you jump into, or the next step would be to actually do the hybrid application, to make it a hybrid application. But before that, we just need to make a short digression and just talk about the most important concept that enables you to do the migration sequentially, which will help us further understand the whole concept. And that process is called, or concept is called, the component upgrade or downgrade. So basically, with the help of an upgrade package that the Angular team developed, you can actually upgrade an AngularJS component, just upgrade it and use it without any changes to the code implementation in your Angular template or the Angular part of the app. And also vice versa, you can also just write a new Angular component and then just use the upgrade package to downgrade it and then use it in the AngularJS template in the Angular part of the app without changing any of the implementation of the components itself. And that's really important, enables you then to do all the stuff that we are going to talk about. So here, this is the Angular upgrade. That's the package that the Angular team worked on. It actually contains all the tooling, let's say, to bootstrap your hybrid application, also to do the exchange of components, services, providers between the two frameworks in the hybrid app. So it's basically a glue that holds all the hybrid application together. And before we see how it works, let's just see the component comparison. So on the left-hand side, we have an AngularJS component, really a simple one, that's written in the component syntax that was introduced in AngularJS 1.5. And you can see that each component is a file. It has a defined template. You have a controller, which is just a class. And then there is a constructor for the injectables and maybe some hooks for the component, like the onInit hook. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Angular component. And you can immediately see that actually if somebody is versed in AngularJS, it's not that big of an issue to just jump into Angular. You can see that we have a component decorator on a class that acts as a controller. There is the constructor for injecting, again, the hook, and you have the template styles and so on defined in above the class. And I had a feeling like you could just copy the implementation of the AngularJS component, copy it into Angular, and just do that and do the migration. But the issue is that you, of course, have a bazillion of components in your app. So you're going to do this migration physically for some of the components. But for the others, you can just utilize the upgrade package. And I'm just going to show you quickly how that looks like in code. So we here have a hybrid application. I'm not going to go into details. Now we'll just work with the upgrade and downgrade. And here, a simple way, So a simple way to downgrade your Angular component is to just use the downgrade component function from the Angular upgrade package. And here you just use the downgrade component and pass in the component that you want to downgrade. It's basically just that one line of code, and then register that component as a directive in your AngularJS part of the app. And then you can use this selector to actually refer to it from any AngularJS template. So nothing more to it. And then the other side around, you can also upgrade AngularJS components. And I think we have an example here. So it's a little bit more complicated, but still quite simple. You use the upgrade helper class from the Angular upgrade package, and then you just extend a class that you decorate with this directive decorator. And basically, you call in the base class constructor, you call the base class constructor with the name of the AngularJS component. And by doing that, you're now able to reference this AngularJS component in your Angular template without any changes to the implementation. And that's really crucial for the whole process of migration. So you don't need to physically migrate each and every component. Yeah, that was it from the code so far. Sorry, my slides don't work. Just give them a sec. Everything worked before the presentation.
Let's refresh.
Yeah. Yeah, here they are. So once you're familiar with the concept of migrating components up and down, now we can talk about the migration strategies that you can take when you start to work on the hybrid. What's important to note, the hybrid step, which is this step, is the step that you need to do in one go. So you have your preparation that can take, I don't know, years for AngularJS, and then you need to do the step of hybrid in one go, which means bootstrapping, which means routing. And afterward, you can go with that hybrid in production and then do the migration for as long as you need. And one of the first decisions that you need to make when going hybrid is actually to see what migration strategy to take. So let's first have a look at the bottom-up strategy. This strategy means that you leave all your routing configuration with the AngularJS way, meaning that you use the AngularJS router, and then you start slowly working your way bottom-up. So you first migrate the child components, the children at the bottom, to Angular, and then you use the downgrade component that we just mentioned to just inject them into the AngularJS part of the application. And then you slowly do component by component until the top, and at the very end you just switch the router to the new router, and you ditch the whole hybrid app. And the benefit of this approach is that you don't need to think about routing or everything. You just start to write components in Angular, basically, and inject them into the app. The other approach that's there is the top-down approach, which the name says, obviously, you start from the top. You first migrate the routing configurations to switch to the new router, and you migrate the top modules, and then you just upgrade all the AngularJS components and then just use them as is below. So you don't need to touch the implementation of them. And one obvious benefit of this is this thing here. If you do the hybrid via the top-down approach, your team can just immediately start working in Angular. So all the new stuff, all the new features are going to be written completely in Angular, and you have this old code base in AngularJS that you can migrate whenever you find the time. So you just go then bottom up until the end, and then you again ditch the hybrid app. So that's it from the strategies, and now Chris will talk about the bootstrapping of the hybrid app.
Thank you. Okay. So on the previous slides, we didn't show the full truth. We didn't show the whole application, because whenever you have a hybrid application, you always have actually an Angular 1 application on top of it. So that means there's the root component is always an Angular 1 component. Doesn't matter whether you go top down or bottom up. The reason why is because you need to bootstrap your both applications in parallel, and they need one entry point. The bootstrapping is quite different to how you would bootstrap the application normally. So that's why we go into detail a little bit here. And let's see these three levels here. So the first level, the one with the AngularJS logo, is how a bootstrapping normally works. Very simplified, of course. So what you would have is you would have a dependency injection phase where you load all the modules, fill up your IOC container, and when you're ready for everything, you go through your DOM, find your root element, and then load the application into this component, into this element. That's a normal bootstrapping. So now on the second level, you see that we need now both Angular frameworks loaded in parallel. And they both have the bootstrapping phase. And they both have a DI phase and a root phase where they look for the root component. But we don't want to have the application loaded twice. And we just have one root component. So what we have to do is we have to disable the phase where Angular 4 looks for a root component and just run the DI phase of this Angular 4 module bootstrapping, which looks then like the third level here, where you have the Angular 4 DI, then the AngularJS DI, and then AngularJS loads up the application into the AngularJS root component. This is how it works theoretically. I'm going to show you how that looks in code. So let's start at line 24. So what you see in line 24 is the loading of Angular 4. So that's the first phase. We load Angular 4, the Bootstrap module, this app module here, and fill the IOC container of Angular 4. When Angular 4 is finished, we then hand it over to Angular 1, which then bootstraps Angular 1, this module here, my app module, which is up here, my app module, and then looks for the directive, for the element within the DOM, and bootstraps application. The trick to disable the root phase for Angular 4 lies in the app module itself. So we have this app module you want to bootstrap, and here we have to tell Angular not to bootstrap itself after loading all the modules, which can be done by just overwriting the ng to bootstrap. That's all to bootstrapping. Now let's get back. Oh, I forgot the frog.
I forgot the frog.
let's go back to the slides, and Ognjen tells you about the routing.
Yeah, let's just visit routing also for a split second. So it's the second important thing while setting up your hybrid application. And again, you have multiple approaches. So as we mentioned already, with the bottom-up approach, you leave the AngularJS router as is, and you, at the end of the migration process, you just switch to the new router. And on the right-hand side, completely, you have the top-down approach, where you immediately migrate everything and use the new Angular 4 router, and then the components below are not aware of routing, and you then just migrate the components, services, and so on. And there is also this mixed approach. So actually, the Angular team made sure that you can actually run both routers at the same time in one hybrid application, which really provides a lot of flexibility. The issue in our case was, unfortunately, that we relied on the component router in the AngularJS, and as you probably all know, it was deprecated. So we tried to take this mixed approach, but there were no documentation at all on the internet, and we experimented a little bit, couldn't make it run. So we just decided to go with the top-down approach in routing and just migrate immediately to Angular 4. And I'm going to show you again in code why was that possible for us. So basically, we go back to the hybrid application. And now, let me just try it like this. We have the cars, let's say component branch, which is completely migrated to Angular, and we have the drivers component branch, so the other branch, which still has some AngularJS components at the bottom. And then in the application module, which is the root module of the hybrid application, we just imported the router, the new router, and then set some, let's say, top-level routes if you have them. And what's important here is that we disable the initial navigation. So basically, this relates to the thing that Chris already mentioned, which is how the bootstrapping is happening. So if you just visit that for a split second, you can see that in the bootstrap process, the Angular part of the application is bootstrapping first. And since the component that it needs to bootstrap into is not there, if you don't disable the initial navigation, a router would have issues. So what you do is disable it in the application module and then just enable it back in the root component itself by injecting the Angular router. And when the component is initialized, you can just do the initial navigation immediately. So that's just one trick that gave us some headaches. And then the other part is now, if you remember, so the drivers branch of the component branch drivers. So what we did was migrate the top-level component of that branch, which is the driver component in this case. So here it's really just simple, it just contains the outlet. And then in the configuration, routing configuration of that branch, we, in that component, in that module, the root module, we set up all the routing for that branch. So we basically just pick up all the routing configuration from below and just set it in that top module. And that way we can completely switch to the new router. And then the AngularJS components that are used in the routing configuration below, they are just wrapped, let me just show you that, and upgraded using the upgrade component. So basically we have AngularJS components that are completely dumb in regard to routing. And then we have the top modules that are just aware of the routing and do it for us. And now the obvious issue here with this approach is, imagine that your driver component, AngularJS component, has some ng outlets inside and maybe has even more nested routes. So then this approach would be really hard, or maybe even impossible to do. And in that case, you would need to either go with the bottom-up approach or try to use the mixed approach if you're lucky and you didn't rely on the component router. And for us, so this was possible mainly because the routing configuration of our application was flat. So we could just pick up everything to the top modules and leave the routing configuration there. And basically, that's it from the hybrid part. So with that, you're left with the third step, which is to continuously migrate. Chris will talk more about it.
Okay. Now the great thing is now we're out of this dark zone where we have to finish our application to migrate. We can now deploy to production without any problems. And now we have to think how we get farther, because eventually we want to have a full migration to Angular 4 and no AngularJS code left. We now think of all the AngularJS code as a technical debt, but it's not that bad because this technical debt depth doesn't grow, it just stays there, or we can even minimize the amount of AngularJS code. We didn't want now just to go there and assign some sprints to just migrate everything, because we wanted to continue working on features. So our strategy was that we have like 3 different kind of ways how to deal with the AngularJS code. So the first way is, if there's a new page, that's easy, we just code it with Angular 4. Second thing is, there are some pages we have to do some major refactorings. So whenever we touch an existing AngularJS page, we're also going to migrate it. So this leads to over the time, whenever we build features, we also migrate some stuff back to Angular 4 to Angular 4. And the third thing is, there is some code we already know we're never going to touch again. And for this code, we just wait till we have a certain amount of AngularJS code left, and then we have to take some time and get rid of the rest of the code.
You can just switch. You can just switch the slide for me, thanks. And then the next step in the continuous migration, it's dealing with services. And I'm not going to go into any code examples here, just want to mention this. So basically, when you start the hybrid application, you get full-blown 2 frameworks running side by side, AngularJS and Angular. AngularJS has this big namespace where all the services reside, which are singletons. On the Angular side, you have the tree of dependency injectors, meaning that you can have multiple instances. But when you cross the boundary, when you use one service in another framework, you're always working with singletons in the hybrid application. And using the upgrade package that I just mentioned, you can also upgrade or downgrade services. That means that if you have a mission-critical service in AngularJS, which is, I don't know, a monster service, and you just don't have the time to migrate it, you can just upgrade it and inject it into Angular part and just use it for as long as you want. And also vice versa. If you want to downgrade, you can easily do that. So you will just pass a singleton instance of Angular service to AngularJS. And this really gives you the flexibility to do whatever, to approach migration in whatever way you want. So, yeah, that's basically it. With this, you have the running hybrid, and then you have the option to continuous migrate for as long as you want. And then we can switch to the issues, of course.
Yeah. So, mostly worked out pretty well. The tooling of the Angular team provided, the documentation is really, really good. But we also had some issues and some tricky things to deal with. And we highlighted 4 of them today. So the first one is not an obvious, but it took us some time to figure out the correct solution. Problem was, we used Bootstrap 3 as our CSS framework. And as you might know, Bootstrap has a CSS part and a JavaScript part, and the JavaScript part is usually implemented with the Angular directives for AngularJS or Angular directives. Problem was that the AngularJS directives, they only work with Bootstrap 3, and Angular 4 directives, they only work with Bootstrap 4. So, but the CSS was shared. So we tried out some approaches, and we figured out that the easiest way to actually deal with this problem was to have a Bootstrap 4 migration on the CSS level. So now our application runs on Bootstrap 4, and which works great with the Angular part of the directives. And to fix the AngularJS part of the directives, we just had to apply some CSS fixes. So for example, when you have a drop-down, it applies a class, and this class maybe has a different name now. So we had to apply some CSS fixes to make it work again. Was not that difficult, it was like 20 lines of code. We already mentioned the deprecated router. So when we started our AngularJS project, we thought, let's use a component router, because they promised that it's going to be the easiest way to migrate to Angular 4. Unfortunately, on our way, they deprecated the router. So that put us in a situation where we actually had to get rid of it. We solved that by having this top-down approach and completely switched to the Angular 4 router. Next thing is the DI minification. Who knows what the problem here is, the DI minification problem? Some of you? So just to sum it up, the thing is when you minify your code, the parameter gets minified as well, and Angular goes by the actual name to figure out what you want to inject. This is not a nice task to do, because you have to do it manually. You have to define the string as well. And we solved that in Angular 1 with a Webpack plugin. With Angular 4, it has a great CLI, and you don't have to worry about Webpack configuration at all. But you also can't do much without ejecting it. If you eject the CLI Webpack configuration, you have to manually maintain it after that. So we didn't want to do that. And our solution to that problem was to just do the minification fixes manually in Angular, instead of ejecting the Webpack configuration. And last, but probably most important thing is, you probably have a lot of third-party dependencies in your Angular 1 application. And when you go into hybrid or even migrate, you have to make sure that for every AngularJS library, for example, Toast library or loading bar library or whatever, that there is a counterpart in Angular 4. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where the application behaves differently if you are in Angular 4 part of the application or in Angular 1 part of the application. Okay. So these were the tricky things. Now let's go and have a summary of our talk.
Yeah, sure.
Let's come on.
Yeah. So just as an overview of the things that we mentioned already so far. So first thing first, AngularJS is a really good framework. So don't do the migration just because it's new and it's popular. What's important to note, you will not get anything out of the box. So if your application is slow in AngularJS, if you just switch it to Angular, it's going to be slow, nevertheless. So you would need to work on specifically fine-tuning the performance and so on in order to get it to run better. So really think about the efforts versus the benefits, and then go with the decision. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing is refactor your AngularJS application towards Angular 4. As I already mentioned, you want to be in this situation where you actually have to migrate in this go hybrid phase as short as possible. So make sure that you prepare your application very well. Take your time to prepare your application. It makes it much, much easier to actually migrate.
Yep. The third part is to define, also we can call it a part of preparation, is to see which approach suits you best. So in our case, as you know, the component router plus the routing configuration, which was flat made it easy to select the top-down approach. But you should also consider all the other aspects. For example, is your application going to be developed parallelly with new features as you do the migration? And that could help see which approach should suit you best.
Yeah. And also think about whether you want to do the migration, because you have really great tools. The great documentation is really, if you do it properly, it's not much pain to do the migration, but it still takes a lot of work. So you have to kind of know what you get into it with all the work you have to do.
Yeah. Also, start in small steps. This basically means that once you're ready with your preparation, just see what is the minimal effort that you can put to get a hybrid running in production. So you don't want to dive in and to have some kind of a deadline, work for a month to try to refactor. Nobody's going to like that, especially the clients. But just see what's the minimal effort and try to just invest like a week, 2 weeks just to get the hybrid running, and then you can take your time to slowly finish the work during as much time as you need.
Yeah. And our talk, the title is Pain-Free Migration. And I think the most important point to take from today's talk is to have a pain-free migration is to embrace hybrid. That's really the most important thing. When you embrace hybrid and you're ready to go to production with your application, it really takes away all the pressure you would have otherwise when you do the migration.
Yeah. So that's about it. Hopefully we'll help you to decide on the migration strategy, or do you even want to do it or not.
Pitanja.
Hey. So a couple of questions,
That
guys.
was good, yeah.
It was good.
So if you one is if you do a top-down upgrade, like what you're saying about, can you leave out the old components in AngularJS and just do the new ones in Angular 4? And do you see benefits of that approach or not?
That's one of the things that we mentioned. So if that was the question, you actually, when you go with the top-down approach and migrate all the top modules with the routing configuration, so everything new that you develop now is completely just Angular, from routing to the components to the services. So the team can just work in Angular. And the AngularJS part can be left that you work on it whenever you have a need or when you just want to finish the migration.
And after all of this experience, would you consider Angular 4 starting from scratch?
Definitely, yeah. I really got to like Angular 4. As Ognjen already told about the advantages of Angular, it's a really fast framework, nice to develop, and I think it's ready for the future.
Yeah.
Anybody last-minute questions?
You have to do the next slide, huh?
Then congratulations. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Voila.
Yeah, cool.